Let me just say something about what GAVI is. GAVI was established in 2000 as a innovative public-private partnership. The idea was to be able to take new vaccines that exist, that you got as a child, that we take for granted, and to make those available for children living in situations like you've seen. The idea is that these tools should be available to every child in the world. GAVI works in the 73 poorest countries. We work purely on economics. So if your country is below a certain cutoff line, they're eligible for GAVI. If they're above it, they're not. What we're trying to do is make this a movement. We'd like every country in the world to be supporting immunization, both financially but also psychologically, because at the end of the day, people travel and viruses travel, and what we want is a culture that says every child is immunized. It's much in the news today dealing with infectious diseases, given what's going on with Ebola. All 5 of the Ebola-affected countries are GAVI countries. We've worked there to build up their immunization, and of course, now with Ebola, immunization's going down. And today, more children, more people are dying in those countries probably from vaccine-preventable diseases than are dying from Ebola. Now, of course, we have to stop Ebola so it doesn't overtake that, but just to give you an idea of the problem. And of course, GAVI will be looking at how we can work on trying to make available, ultimately, an Ebola vaccine if one proves to be efficacious. And again, we can talk about that if we want.
In light of the recent Ebola outbreak and then other emerging infectious diseases, what is GAVI doing and working with pharma and other donor countries to accelerate the process of getting candidate vaccines up to market and into the field?
So on Ebola, you know, in a sense, the tragedy on Ebola is that the good news is there are now vaccine candidates that are in humans, and there's a number of others that are coming behind it. The bad news is that those were not developed for the countries that have the outbreaks. They were actually developed as part of a worry of bioterrorism, and knowing that Ebola was a particularly lethal agent, it was one of the agents that was picked to make vaccines. And these vaccines have been around for close to 10 years now, and they just haven't moved very far. And part of it is that there's no market for anybody to develop this, a private company to develop it. And there also was the difficulty of how do you test it, given the fact that the outbreaks occur sporadically in different places. And so now, with the outbreak, there's been a huge attempt to try to accelerate these. And these normally would take 5, 6, 7, 8 years to go through the whole testing process. The trials, you know, the UK, for example, launched a trial at Oxford, a few weeks ago. The regulatory agency did the review of that trial in 4 days. Now, I've done a lot of trials in the UK, and I can tell you that the normal regulatory turnaround is not 4 days. And so we're now seeing what the world can do if they really push. And there's a discussion to say that, you know, we can have efficacy data kind of, you know, end of first, beginning of second quarter of next year, which would be an unbelievable compression of the timelines. So what is GAVI doing? So we're talking to all of the companies. There's been a push on the research side, and there's a lot of research agencies that want to get vaccines out and move them forward. What hasn't had so much of a discussion is, what do we do if we have a successful vaccine? How do we scale it up? How do we go ahead and get it fill and finished and ready for use? What's going to be the scenario at that point? Best case scenario, Ebola is controlled with the big push now. You know, we don't need it. That would be great. What if it goes the other way? What if it spreads to other cities and it explodes? And, you know, then we need millions of doses, tens of millions of doses. If it does go away, how do we make sure there's a stockpile that's put together so that there is a future outbreak, we have vaccine available? So those are the types of issues that GAVI is going to be dealing with. And we're working with the manufacturers to understand their needs, and then we'll go to our board with a plan on what can happen during this period. I think the critical question, if you want to know the one thing, is going to be, do you invest and scale up on vaccines before you know they work? So, you know, and part of that depends upon a perception of how bad things are. You know, from my perspective, we do a lot of things, particularly around the military for protection, where we spend massive amounts of money for things that we don't think are going to happen, but just in case we want to be protected. So the question is, you know, how do we value that? It wouldn't be in the big picture of the world a lot of money to go ahead and take each of the vaccines that are now in clinical trial and the one that's behind it, or maybe the one behind that, and to go ahead and do that work. Even if they didn't work, it wouldn't be a huge loss. But again, if the worst case scenario is, you know, a very, very fast spread, more severe disease, you'd be awfully happy if you could have cut some of the time off. So those are the types of debates that are going to have to happen going forward.